There it is. And so my name is Jace Nunes, and I'm with the Citrus Heights Water District. And before we get into today's Water Smart class, Colossal Compost, Miraculous Mulch, and Spectacular Soil, I just have a few reminders. First off, all our Water Smart classes are posted to our YouTube. And so if you want to go back and rewatch this class, we'll have it up shortly. Or if you want to check out any other of our classes, we have them all up there. And next, I just want to talk about our rebates and programs. We have a free smart irrigation controller and water audit program where we will actually have a person from WaterWise, a company, come out there and install a irrigation controller for free. So, and then also we have our rebate programs. We have an ultra low flush toilet, pressure reducing valve, and high efficiency clothes washer rebate. So if you're interested in any of that, you could email us at the water efficiency email or call our office. And if you want to do any research of yourself, our website is linked below. And without any further ado, I want to introduce our instructor for today, Steve Zion.
Thanks a lot, Jace.
Yeah.
We're here to talk about Colossal Compost, Miraculous Mulch, and Spectacular Soil. My name's Steve Zion, and when I give a presentation, I like to give people some background so they know I have some expertise on the subject. I'm not just some quack throwing out information. I graduated from the University of Wisconsin with a degree in soil science. Upon completion of my degree, I became a Wisconsin certified soil tester. When I moved out to California, they did not have a program, and they still don't, so I couldn't become a California certified soil tester. I'm a pedologist, which means I study soils out in the natural environment. For me, it's in landscapes and gardens, and not in a laboratory. Things don't work in a laboratory in soil like they do out in the actual environment. I'm retired, but before I retired, I was a California certified nursery professional where I managed a local nursery, and we managed it all organically. I was also a landscaper, ran my own landscape maintenance business called Living Resources Company. We did that all organically as well, and I was a certified river-friendly eco-landscaper. And even though I'm retired, I still do teach, and I am a river-friendly green gardener instructor. And so the simple truth is everything starts with the soil, and I mean everything, as you will soon find out. But what is soil? Soil is about 49% mineral matter in the Sacramento region and 50% pore space. And of that pore space, depending upon when you irrigate, just after you irrigate, most of that pore space is going to be filled with water. If you're in an area in the Sacramento region where you're not irrigating at all in the summertime, halfway through the summer, almost all that pore space is going to be filled with air. And what your plants and the soil biology want is about half and half. You want half air and half water. Then about 1% of that soil that you have is organic matter. And of that 1%, 85% is humus, 10% is live roots, and 5% of that 1% organic matter is organisms, living critters. And that's where it all really happens in the soil, as I will show you shortly. Now, a lot of you in the Sacramento region and at Citrus Heights have compacted clay soils. And the problem with compacted clay soils is they are poor in pore space, as you will find out. And there are ways to fix that, which we will explain. That mineral material, that 49% of your soil, is made up of sand, silt, and clay. And the only difference between sand, silt, and clay is size. Sand being the largest particle, silt in between, and the clay being the smallest. Now, when you're talking about sand, silt, and clay, the proportion of sand, silt, and clay is the feel of the soil, often referred to as the feel of the soil. And you can actually take soil in your hand, and if it feels gritty, that's the sand component. The part that feels like flour is the silt. And when the soil is dry, the clay portion of the soil is going to be really hard. When the soil is moist, that clay portion will be very, very slippery. And with a lot of training, and you go to your universities and get a lot of training on how to do a hand test, you can figure out the proportions of sand, silt, and clay just by playing with it in your hand. But as a better gardener, you'll get an idea of whether you have sand, whether you have silt, and whether you have clay. But it's important to know what your soil texture is. And so you want to do what's called the soil texture jar test. And you get a jar and you fill it about a third of the way full of soil. You want to take away the sticks and the stones that'll break your bones and maybe break that jar. And then you add about 2/3 of that jar filled with water. And then you get to the hard part. You need to make sure that you cover it tightly, and then you shake it, and then you shake it some more, and then you shake it some more. And when you can't shake it anymore, you shake it some more. And then when you can't shake it anymore, you give it to a young child and let them shake it as long as they can. The whole idea is you need to get every single sand, silt, and clay particle to be floating around there independently. Then you set it down, and in our area, we have a lot of fine clays, and it can take about 70 up to 72 hours for all of that soil to settle. You need to measure this after that water is clear. And so then you will see that you've got in this particular jar 3 layers of soil, and you'll always have almost always have 3 layers of soil. The sand will settle out first, then the silt, and then finally the clay. And then you use a metric ruler, and because it's easier to calculate the proportion of sand, silt, and clay. And here in this example, you've got 2 millimeters of sand, 1 millimeter of silt, and 1 millimeter of clay on the top. And so we've got 50% sand. So you go to what's called the soil textural triangle, and you go over here and you go to the percentage of sand, it's 50%. And then you go up this diagonal to where you get 25% clay. And where those meet, that's your soil texture. And it just so happens it's the 25% silt as well. And so that jar has a soil texture of a sandy clay loam. And so you can figure out, using a soil jar test, the exact soil texture of your soil. Now, I want to point out, if you look at the left corner of the triangle, for the soil to be classified as a sand, you need 90% sand in your soil. In order for your soil to be classified as a silt, you need 80% silt. But with your clay soils, you only need 40% clay, and that soil can be considered a clay soil. So it's the dominant texture in your soil. So now let's take a look at these 3 kinds of soils textures independently. We've got 3 buckets here. The one on the left is filled with basketballs and watermelons that represent sand. The middle one is got softballs and grapefruit to represent silt. And the one on the right is golf balls and eggs to represent clay. Now, which one of these has more pore space? And I'm sure that some of you are saying the sand. A couple of you might say silt, but without a doubt, and it's not even close, the clay soils have a lot more pore space. The pore spaces are smaller, but there's a lot more pore space there. Now, we're doing this for the Citrus Heights Irrigation District, so it's important to know which one holds more water. Well, I showed you earlier what the water exists in the pore space. So if the clay soil has more pore space, it must be able to hold more water, and in fact, it does. Now, the size of the pore spaces is much smaller in the clay soil. And so when water moves through the clay soil, it's going to move much slower. Okay, so just keep that in mind when you're irrigating. So why is this important? It's going to determine how often you irrigate, the amount that you irrigate, and how quickly you can irrigate. The sandy soil, you can irrigate relatively quickly and it'll move into the soil. You do the same thing with the clay soil, a lot of it's going to run off. Now, which one has more surface area? again, that's the clay. And that's kind of important because a lot of the activities that go on in the soil happen on the surface of the sand, silt, and clay. And so if you've got a lot more surface area, there's a lot more places for things to happen, good things to happen. So there are advantages to having a clay soil, even though you may not think so. Okay. So let's talk about how water moves through your soil, and depending upon the texture of your soil. On a sandy soil, you've got those large pore spaces, and gravity, if you've got a spigot and you turn it on just so it drips down, that most of that water, when it hits the soil, it's going to move into the soil very, very quickly through those large pore spaces, and it's going to move down through the soil very, very quickly. Now, if you turn on the water at the same flow rate, which is very slow, in a clay soil, it's got those small pore spaces. The water does not move through clay through the force of gravity because those pore spaces are too small. And so it moves through what's called capillary action. It actually gets sucked into the soil. And so it will take roughly about twice as long for that water to move down to the same depth as you have with your sandy soils. So you've got to apply the water much, much slower. Otherwise, it's just going to run off and be wasted, and it'll take all sorts of pollutants and various things away with it. Now, also notice that with the clay soil, because the water is being sucked down, it's also sucked out. And so it spreads out much farther. And so when you're if you're using drip systems and drip emitters, realize that in a sandy soil, because the water doesn't go out very far, you're going to have to put those emitters a lot closer together. In a clay soil, you can space those emitters farther apart because the water is going to get sucked out. So just keep that in mind when you're irrigating. Now, let's say you don't like that clay soil. You've got problems with the water moving into the soil. You get a lot of ponding and it's hard to dig and your plants don't like it. And you want to improve the texture of your soil. And you're thinking of taking that nice clay soil, and I mentioned several benefits of it. You should be loving your clay soil. And I mentioned the soil textural triangle. Maybe if you just added sand, you could get a better texture of your soil. Well, what do building contractors do when they take clay and then they add sand? What's the end result? You get cement. And I don't think any of you want to be growing your garden and landscape in cement. So don't try and alter the soil texture. Whatever your soil's texture is just fine. You just have to learn to work with it. So how do you improve the function of your soil, in particular a clay soil, for example, without adjusting the soil's texture? And you do so by improving what's called the soil's structure. Well, what is soil structure? It's the construction of soil aggregates. And you typically start with a individual soil particle over here on the left. And then you maybe throw in some fertilizer and some organic matter and more soil particles. And then you have to have some soil biology. And you've got the little individual circles, the little individual green circles there. Those are little microscopic bacteria, for example, that exude glues, and they glue the sand, silt, and clay particles and the organic matter together. And you get these long strands like fungi, and they tie the sand, silt, and clay particles and organic matter together, creating what's called an aggregate. And then the soil biology glues and ties these individual aggregates together to create soil structure. And that combination of soil aggregates is called a PED. And here on the left, you've got soil that has no structure. You've got your just individual sand, silt, and clay particles. And it's not a very hospitable environment for your roots or the beneficial soil biology in there that creates soil structure. This is what a good soil looks like that has good soil structure. You can see the crumbs and you can see the aggregates there that are going to make it really good and favorable for root growth in the soil biology. Now, one of the more important things to realize when you have good soil structure is you get a diversity of pore space size. And you can see in this picture, you've got a root over here in the upper right, and you've got all sorts of critters. You've got a little mite there and a nematode there, and there are all sorts of critters living in that soil. But you also got these small pore spaces, and these small pore spaces primarily are used for the small microbes to hide so they don't get eaten by the bigger guys, but it also stores a little bit of water that the plant roots and the biology can use. Then you've got medium-sized pore spaces. That's where the majority of the water is stored in your soil that is available to the soil biology and the plant roots. And then what's important with good soil structure is you get these large pore spaces. And so when you irrigate, the water can move into the soil if you have these large pore spaces and move through the soil. And what's important is after you are done irrigating, the gravity will pull the water out of these large pore spaces so that the end result is you have air in your soil. And it's really important. And this is one of the problems that people have with clay soils. Excuse me, I need a drink here for a second. But the clay soils, the pore spaces are really small, they don't drain, and so there's not enough air, and you get root rot in a lot of your clay soils if you don't irrigate absolutely perfectly. So it's really important when you're thinking about soil structure is you're creating that diversity of pore spaces so you get air and water and everything can move and function well in a soil. So how do you get those large pore spaces? You don't till the soil. You use the soil biology. There's all these different kinds of soil biology that move through the soil, and they're pushing those sand, silt, and clay particles and pieces of organic matter around, creating large-sized pore spaces. So it's all about creating a favorable environment for all of these little critters, the ones that glue and tie the soil together, and the ones that kind of push things around to create the large pore spaces. So if you've got poor soil structure and you're trying to irrigate, and you're trying to, or it's raining, what happens to that water? Well, the water without those large pore spaces is going to have a hard time getting in there. It kind of puddles on top. And if there's any kind of slope, it's going to run off and it's going to take some soil with it. It might also take some fertilizer and the pesticides with it. And if it's your typical front yard, that water is going to flow over the sidewalk into the gutter, which then takes those chemicals and soil directly without being treated into our local creeks and streams. Meanwhile, if you've got good soil structure, even with a clay soil, that water is going to move into the soil and through the soil, and you're not going to get that runoff. And the roots will get the moisture that they need. The soil biology will get the moisture that they need. So what's really going on underground, underneath our feet? Let's learn about what's going on in that spectacular soil. The soil is alive, and that's one of the most important things you need to realize. There's critters that live down there that make everything work, that make your plants grow. In a single teaspoon of soil, you've got more critters living there are people on earth. So if you were gardening this morning, you didn't clean and do a pedicure underneath your nails. Imagine how many critters are creeping and crawling underneath your nails in the soil that's down there. Now, in a healthy soil, you have what's called the rhizosphere, which is an area surrounding the root. The root is that big thing in the middle that looks nice and healthy and robust. And all of those lines and squiggles and dots, that's soil biology. And they primarily live very, very close to the roots. And so in a healthy soil, you've got this robust, healthy rhizosphere. In a dead soil, if you maybe used synthetic fertilizers or synthetic pesticides, or you've tilled the soil, you've killed the soil biology. And so you have very, very little rhizosphere. The plants aren't getting the nutrients and the water they need, and you have this sick-looking root. So one of the real things to realize is there's some really important interactions going on in the rhizosphere in a healthy soil. In fact, the plant roots and the soil biology live together in what I like to call is an assisted living rhizosphere. And you can see the root on the right is that kind of camel colored area. The bluish area is the rhizosphere that is just loaded with soil biology. And then on the left, you've got, those are the tips of roots, and they're leaking liquid, okay? And we'll explain what that's all about in a second. Now, the plants in that rhizosphere are kind of acting like a root cellar. They're storing water and nutrients and making them available to the plant roots. They also provide plant growth regulators. They provide pest management. And they actually help the plants communicate via the Wood Wide Web. It is the most advanced social networking system on the planet. It's got our computers way outdone, okay? Now realize that plants can perceive and respond to environmental changes. They're not just out there and doing their thing. They produce what are called root exudates, those liquid drops. And those liquid drops regulate soil biology to improve the plant's health, pest protection, and to provide food and water. And the plants actually use 40% of their energy to produce these exudates. These exudates consist of proteins, sugars, and carbohydrates, kind of like cakes and cookies, if you will. And they put out different cakes and cookies depending upon what's going on in the environment around them. They will stimulate beneficial microscopic organisms. For example, if they need phosphorus, they will stimulate particular bacteria that will mine the phosphorus out of the sand, silt, and clay particles and make it available to your plants. If your plant root is being eaten by something, it will exude a particular chemical that will fight off that pest or encourage a beneficial organism in the soil to fight that pest off for them. And so they're putting out these different exudates at different times of the year, depending upon their particular needs. So it varies through the season, and all life on this planet is dependent on this relationship. Now, there's a lot of biodiversity and function going on in the soil, and it's often referred to as the soil food web, as this, shown here, where you have the sun shining down on the plants, and through the miracle of photosynthesis, the plants take in carbon dioxide, sequester the carbon into the organic material that is the plant, and then they release oxygen so people like us have something to breathe. Then that organic matter eventually dies and is eaten by microscopic decomposers, who are eaten by microscopic predators, who are eaten by bigger predators, who are eaten by bigger predators. But that doesn't really explain how it works. It explains what's happening, but how it works is described here in what I like to call the poop loop. Most of you might consider it called nutrient cycling, where again, you get the sun, and the living plants are producing, sequestering the carbon, producing organic matter, and then they're being eaten. That dead organic matter is being eaten by decomposers. And these decomposers are very, very efficient of taking the nitrogen out of that organic material and storing it in their body for use later in the soil system. And so they're kind of like bags of fertilizer. And then those bags of fertilizer, the bacteria and the fungi, are then eaten by the microscopic soil predators. These guys are not very efficient at using nitrogen, and so they need to get rid of the excess nitrogen, and they do that by pooping. And then the bigger guys are eating the microscopic predators. They're even less efficient at using nitrogen, and so there's more poop looping going on. And every time a bigger guy eats, they become increasingly less efficient. And so all this poop looping is going on. And so all these guys on the right side of this picture are kind of like fertilizer spreaders. They're moving around through the soil, depositing nitrogen that's going to feed the plants. And this is exactly why Mother Nature isn't going out there every spring and fall and applying fertilizer. Mother Nature doesn't have to run to the nursery every spring and fall and buy bags of fertilizer, okay? So if you have a healthy living soil and you've got this wonderful soil food web, it improves the soil structure, it improves plant growth and plant health, it improves water quality, water storage, water availability, drought resistance, erosion control, and pest management. This is one of my favorite pictures. This is a little microscopic nematode. It's a little tiny worm-like critter. This particular one eats the roots of our plants, some of our plants. And so the plant doesn't like having its roots eaten. So it exudes a particular chemical to signal this strandy-like critter, which is a fungi, and it communicates through the exudate that these nematodes are here. And the microscopic fungi gets all excited and it starts producing these rings that you see in this slide. And these rings exude a chemical that attracts the nematode. The nematode goes inside the ring, and just like a Venus flytrap, when a fly gets in there, it closes up very, very quickly. The same thing happens when the inside of the wall gets contacted. It fills up with fluid, trapping the nematode, and then it basically feeds and eats the nematode. Works. It's really, really pretty cool. So let's unlock more of the secrets that's going on in the soil. Let's talk about some of the critters that are there. We've got the bacteria, and they're nitrogen factories. They take nitrogen out of the air that you need in those big pore spaces and put it into the plants and release it into their bodies as they are nutrient accumulators. They provide growth hormones, and they're little one-celled critters. And so, they have to figure out a way so that when you irrigate and when it rains, they don't get just flushed down into the soil. So they glue themselves to the sand, silt, and clay particles and pieces of organic matter. And that glue also glues the sand, silt, and clay particles together, creating soil structure. They also produce an alkaline slime that can help raise the soil pH. So if you've got a soil dominated by bacteria, you're likely going to have a pH higher than you maybe want. But it's a way to increase the soil's pH. Bacteria also can suppress disease and decompose toxins. Then there's fungi, and you may have had problems with various fungi damaging your plants, but realize most of them are beneficial. There are a bunch of fun guys and fun gals, and they're string-like structures that tie the soil particles together. They're nutrient accumulators again. They're the bags of fertilizer. They decompose organic matter. That middle slide shows the fungi actually feeding on a piece of organic matter. They produce acidic enzymes. And so if you've got a soil that's dominated by fungi, it's going to be lowering the pH of your soil. And they also suppress pest problems, as you can see the picture on the lower right that I just talked about a moment ago. Excuse me. Then there's the mycorrhizal fungi, and they extend the area of water and nutrient absorption by the plants. Here's your typical root, and it needs the moisture and fertilizer and nutrients to be right up against the root in order for it to be absorbed. When you've got the mycorrhizal fungi, you can see it's got the same exact root system, the same size, but all these other lines, and eventually the whole area is covered with these mycorrhizal fungi, which will provide access to the nutrients in that water in that whole area to the plant. So the plant's going to be very, very healthy because has better access to more water and nutrients. They create soil structure not only by tying the sand, silt, and clay particles together, but also gluing them. There's that symbiotic relationship where the plant is feeding the fungi and the fungi is feeding and providing moisture to the plant. And these are the guys that really work with that wood wide web, helping plants communicate with each other. Here in that center picture on the right, the plant on the left is having problems with aphids. It tells the plant on the right, who hasn't been attacked by aphids yet, that the aphids are here and that plant should start producing chemicals to help fight off the aphids, which it will do. Plants communicate with each other as well and care for each other. The mothers of the forest will take care of the babies of the forest because they're not getting enough light, because it's dark at the bottom. And they can tell their babies versus somebody else's other baby, and they will give more nourishment to their own little seedlings. And so you've got this wide array of expansive root system that helps the plant outcompete weeds, because weeds generally don't have the mycorrhizal association. And the cool thing is you can go to your local nursery and you can buy mycorrhizal fungi. There are products, and some of your organic fertilizers contain them. So in your spectacular soil, basically all this soil biology is much like a stomach where they are taking the raw materials and transforming them into forms that your plant can use. It's like a stomach, much like the bacteria and the fungi and all the critters that are living in our digestive system make the food that we put down into our mouth so that we can absorb the nutrients out of them. Okay, so we need to feed the soil. We need to feed the soil biology. And how do we do that? The best way to do that is to provide them food. And the best food for them is compost and mulch. And compost, for example, is a key ingredient to creating healthy soil and healthy drought and pest-resistant plants while mitigating climate change. So what is compost? Compost is the appropriate organic materials placed in a pile where soil organisms can turn waste into a resource, and that will nurture the soil food web, and that will then in result nourish our plants. Okay. Now, who makes compost? Well, gardeners don't make compost. We build compost piles. It's the soil biology, again, that's making the compost. So in order for that to happen, gardeners have to create a compost pile that creates favorable conditions and supplies the biology so that those decomposters can do their job. So what do you need to construct a good compost pile? Well, you need the microscopic organisms because they're the ones who are doing the decomposing. You need macroscopic organisms because after that pile cools down a little bit, like earthworms, they're going to help. These guys need water and they need air and they need the food source. They need the gusto of that compost pile, which is classified either as brown material or green material. And when you're building the compost pile, you want to have typically equal amounts of brown and green materials. And we've got lists there of what is a brown material and what is a green material. Those are some suggestions. The better quality compost is going to have a bigger diversity of different ingredients. You want to put in as much different kind of stuff as you can, avoiding the things that you see in the lower right there in that box that makes it very difficult for the soil biology to do their job. Can cause pest problems as well, and also helps to reduce the particle size of this material before you put it into your compost pile, because the smaller particle size, there's more surface area, like we talked about earlier, for the soil biology to start working and decomposing that material. And these microscopic organisms are also thirsty, so they need some water. They also need air, and you need to supply the soil biology. So you need to add the microbes. The best way to add microbes is with finished compost. If you know somebody who's been making compost or you've been making compost, make sure you always add some of that good quality homemade compost to your new compost pile. If you don't have that, you can also use soil. You can use fresh manure from a non-meat-eating animal. And there are products you can buy at your local nursery that supply the microbes. Just be careful that those products do not contain synthetic fertilizers. Now, when you're building a compost pile, excuse me, I've got something in my throat. You want to try and have that finished compost pile at least 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet. And so that's the size area that you're shooting for. You want to start by putting down a thin layer of brown material on the ground, add some moisture. Then you put down a thin layer of inoculant, the soil biology, the finished compost, the soil, the manure. And then you want to start building your what I like to call a sandwich. And you put various layers that we're going to put down. And the first layer is 4 to 6 inches of brown material, 4 to 6 inches of green material. You want to add moisture. You want that pile to have about 40% moisture, which is equivalent to a squeezed out SpongeBob. And then you want to sprinkle a little of the inoculant down. And then you keep repeating this 4 to 6 inches of brown, 4 to 6 inches of green, moisture, and inoculant until that pile is 3 feet high. And you want to make sure that you want to save some of that brown material for when you're all done constructing your compost pile, because you going to want to put some brown material on the outside of the pile that will discourage pests from entering and digging up your pile. Okay. Then you want to mix all that material up and together and put it into a 3 by 3 by 3 pile or compost bin. Okay. Now, when it's in that 3 by 3 by 3 pile, it's big enough where the soil biology is going to heat up that pile. And that's really, really important, because any pests that were in that organic material, almost all of them will be destroyed by that heat. But when it gets too hot, when it gets over 160 degrees, the problem is they're going to use up all of the oxygen. And so they're going to be starting to be deprived of oxygen. They're also, if it gets much above 160, some of these beneficial microbes, it's too hot and they will die. So it's important to turn your compost pile. You can go online and you can purchase a compost thermometer and turn that pile when it gets up to 160 degrees, putting the stuff that was on the outside to the inside of the new pile, the stuff that was in the inside to the outside. Okay. And again, ideally you're starting with a 3 by 3 by 3 foot pile. By the time it gets up to 160 degrees, it's going to be smaller, and that's fine. But when you're constructing a pile in all of these commercial bins that you can purchase, realize that they're not 3 by 3 by 3 for the most part. And so you're not going to have a big enough area to really get that pile to heat up, or it's going to destroy the pests. So it's really critical that when you're using a bin, not to be adding pests, things like weeds, any part of a weed that can produce itself, which if you're talking Bermuda grass, that means just about any part of the Bermuda grass. You'd also don't want to put organic material that has pests on it, insect pests on it, or diseased leaves should be avoided. Then when you have your finished compost pile, it's going to have this nice earthy smell. It's not going to be hot anymore. It's going to be spongy when you touch it. It's going to be squish. And it's not going to resemble any of the original material. You're not going to say, oh, this is an oak leaf. Oh, this is a twig. And what it's actually in your hands when you're holding that compost pile, the finished compost, is live and dead microbes and their poop. And that compost is going to feed and nourish the soil life that you've got in the soil. It's going to feed that, also provide more soil biology, this is a really good way to take a soil that is lacking soil biology and increase the amount of diversity that you have living in your soil. Worm compost, I think, in my opinion, is the best stuff because the end result of that material is you get a much greater diversity of biology in that material. And you can build your own bin like the one in the upper left. That's my compost bin. But you can go out and buy compost bins commercially that might be a little easier for you to work with, but much more expensive and maybe not as much fun, in my opinion. And you can also go to your local nursery and buy earthworm castings, and they really are magical stuff. And it's not so much the nutrients, which is there's a lot of nutrients there, but it's the soil biology that you're being able to add to your soil that makes this such a great product. Now, when you're buying compost, if you're buying compost commercially and not making it yourself, a couple of cautions. When you're buying it from somebody who is recycling waste materials, like the green waste stuff that we're all recycling now, realize there's a lot of garbage in that material, and so the garbage can be in the final compost as well. And there, in many cases, not every case, but in some cases, the folks that are in charge of making that compost, their main purpose is not to create quality compost, it's to dispose of a waste material. And so the quality of the compost isn't always the best. Now, you're also going to go to your local nurseries and you're going to buy compost. And most nurseries sell numerous compost products. It's really important that you go and read the ingredients on the package to find out what's in there. Try and visually inspect the material. What does it look like? Is it really compost where you can't recognize, oh, this is a twig, this is a branch, this is a leaf. And you might also want to test the pH of that material. A friend of mine, a cooperative extension agent here in Sacramento, did tests on landscape compost and from the landscape yards and bagged materials. And he found that the pH, the acidity or alkalinity of these materials could vary tremendously to the point where you can't really grow plants in it. So it's a good idea to get yourself a little test kit that you see in the lower right. Most nurseries sell them, and ask the nursery if you can take a little sample of the product and test the pH. And the same goes through when you go to a landscape yard and get bulk compost. Their guidelines for creating quality material is not very good. I have known several cases where people buy compost and the pH was so off or the nutrients were so imbalanced, they were incapable of growing plants. So I recommend going to the landscape yard, inspecting the piles, find one that you like, purchase it, and then watch them load it up and watch them take it to your place. They go through so much compost that the pile that you say that you want, if you don't watch them, by the time they load it up for you, that pile might be gone. Okay. So how do you apply this material? One of the best things to do is just apply it to the soil surface as a top dressing or mulch. Do not till it into the soil. Best time to apply it is if you aerate the soil, which is the removal of soil cores, not the punching of holes, but the removal of soil cores. You can apply it after that, then you'll have all those nice soils, and then you can take a broom and put some of that compost into the core holes, and you can incorporate small amounts into the backfill when you're transplanting. And you don't want to add a lot, you just want to add a little bit, not so much to provide nutrients, but to add soil biology so that they can start creating soil texture. Really important with clay soils. You can also brew a compost tea and apply it as a liquid, using either compost or the worm castings, and you can spray it on the leaves. You can also water it in, and you can actually inject it into the soil. So the compost really strengthens the soil food web, provides sources of biology, and improves soil structure, nutrient availability, movement of water, and improves quality and availability, improves a lot of the biological diversity, improves plant health, pest resistance, and drought tolerance, reduces the needs to irrigate and apply fertilizer. And it also helps to sequester carbon and mitigate climate change. All sorts of benefits for utilizing compost. Now, when we're talking about your miraculous mulch, not all mulches are created equal. When you're talking miraculous mulch, it needs to be an organic material placed on the soil surface. Why is it miraculous? Well, it improves soil health, increases the biological diversity in the soil. If you've got organic matter on the soil surface, worms are going to come up every night, feed on that material, bringing that organic material down into the soil, adding organic matter and nutrients, and aerating that soil. Mulch will also suppress weeds, conserves moisture, reducing the amount of irrigation that you're going to need. It moderates the soil temperature and plant temperature, prevents runoff and erosion, all sorts of wonderful benefits. What kinds of things can you use as an organic mulch? Wood chips, which you can get for free from Chip Drop or arborists. There's all sorts of materials that you can find in your landscape, fallen leaves, branches, grass clippings that you can shred and chip and compost and apply as a mulch. And there are other options like bark and newspaper and straw and compost and earthworms. all can be utilized as a mulch. You can also do what's called sheet mulching, which prevents and kills existing weeds, helping to convert a lawn or a weed patch into a water-wise garden without pesticides. And basically, you take your existing soil, you take whatever vegetation is there, and you mow it down as close to the ground as possible, throw down some compost, cardboard, more compost, and then cover it all with mulch. And you will create wonderful soil so that you can put in your water-wise garden or a vegetable garden. There are inorganic mulching materials that are mineral or synthetic, things like rock and stone and sheet plastic, rubber and landscape fabrics. And these things are not miraculous. The soil is alive, it's hungry, and they don't improve the soil's health. They can actually damage the soil, actually heating up the soil and cooking your plant roots. They don't absorb and hold moisture. They can restrict air and water and nutrients from moving into the soil and potentially be toxic. There are alternatives to the landscape fabric, such as weed block paper, Weed Guard Plus, and the cardboard and newspaper utilizing sheet mulching. And so how do you mulch? The first thing you want to do is you want to break up the soil surface crust. And you can use that little tool that we've got there on the right. You can also use a metal garden rake. And you're just trying to break up the crust that's on the soil. You're not trying to till it up. And then depending upon the particle size of the mulch, if it's really small particle size, like an earthworm casting, you only need about two inches deep. If it's a coarse material like the bark or the wood chips, you're going to want to apply it 3 to 6 inches deep. And then after you apply it, you're going to want to water it really, really good. And then also, it's really important that you realize that mulch is going to decompose and you will have to add more on a regular basis. Where do you apply that mulch? You need to apply that mulch beyond what's called the drip line. And you can see in the picture where the drip line is, and those arrows on the right and on the left, that's the area where you should be applying your mulch and your fertilizer and your irrigation. Don't put it up against the base of your plants. It'll create a dry, moist condition. It'll rot the base of your plant, creating a volcano effect where the base of your plant will rot and your tree will fall over. You want to leave a little space away from the base of your plant when you're mulching. You want to keep it away from the side of your house, especially if it's a woody material or you might be inviting termites. In a lawn situation, use a mulching mower instead of bagging, adding grass clippings as a mulch. And again, realize that you're going to have to replace that mulch on a regular basis because it's feeding the soil. A couple of quick tips not relating to the topics that we're discussing that is important for a healthy soil is to only use organic fertilizers. You look for the OMRI and the organic input material logo. Avoid tillage, or at least minimize tillage, because you're destroying the soil structure and killing the soil biology. Practice integrated pest management, trying to eliminate or at least minimize the use of pesticides, and use only organic and least toxic pesticides. Keep off the soil when it's wet, because you will compact the soil, squish out and eliminate those large pore spaces. Beware of bad advice. There's a lot of information on the internet, and not all of it is given by reliable sources. The making of homemade pesticides is, I think, the best example. Almost all of the homemade pesticides that are recommended, such as homemade insecticidal soap, are a bad idea. You want to keep the soil covered. Don't garden naked. You want to have either living plants on the soil. You want to have your mulch, compost, or worm castings on the surface of the soil. And the worms will come up every night, feed on that organic material on the soil surface. They will till up the soil. They will move that organic matter down, improving the quality of your soil. And the result is you get Colossal Compost and Miraculous Mulch, making spectacular soil. So you will have a symphony of the soil. Plant health starts from the ground up with Colossal Compost and Miraculous Mulch, yielding a spectacular living soil. Thanks much for your attention. And I think we'll give this back to Jace and see if there are any questions.
Yeah, first off, thank you, Steve. That was really great. A lot of good information there. There are a few questions that we have in the chat. So the first one kind of goes back to the start of the webinar. But how would you compare the soil as when caught in Wisconsin to the soil that we have here? You mentioned that there's 49% mineral matter here. How about back in Wisconsin?
In many areas back east, they have more organic matter. Out west, it's typically about 1%. Most of the soils back east, it's about 5%. And ideally, what you strive for is anywhere from 5 to 10% organic matter. And when I'm talking about organic matter, a lot of people, I already said don't till your soil. A lot of people here, you want 5% organic matter, and they'll, you can get wood chips for free, and they will till in wood chips. And that's not a good idea, because the wood chips, a lot of carbon in that material. And when you put that on the soil surface, it's wonderful. But when you till it into the soil, all the soil biology is going to work really, really hard at decomposing that material. And in doing so, the soil biology will use all of the nitrogen that's available in your soil to decompose that organic material. And your plants will have deficiencies in nitrogen until that material is decomposed. Now, a lot of people say, well, don't you have the same problem when you put it on the soil surface, the woody material? And that's not the case, because there's not the competition. The roots aren't, for the most part, growing in the mulch. And so the mulch, as it decomposes, the soil biology break that down. The nitrogen and the nutrients will work themselves down into the soil, and you will not get that lack of nitrogen in the soil when you put that woody material on top. But basically, the soils back east naturally have more organic matter in them.
Okay. And then we have another question asking about the compost bins. Why specifically do we want them to be 3 by 3 by 3?
Good question. Why the question is why 3 by 3 by 3? If it's not that big, there's not enough insulation in the pile to get that temperature up there. Because you even in the heat of the summer, and it's 120 degrees, it's still not 160 degrees, and it's going to be, you need that insulation that you get with the size of the pile to provide heat. Just like when you have a home and you've got it insulated well, you don't have to put so much energy into heat that house. It's the same way with a compost pile. And smaller compost piles, you're just not going to get the heat. The soil biology aren't going to create enough heat to break that down to the point where it's going to kill the pest organisms. You can still get quality compost. It won't be as good as if you had a 3 by 3 by 3 pile. Your compost will happen in a smaller pile. It will happen in those bins. I'm not saying it won't. But if you put any diseased material, any insect pests or weed parts, those pest problems are not going to die from the heat in a smaller pile.
Okay. And then another question, where does the compost fit into the soil texture triangle?
The soil texture triangle is strictly the proportion of sand, silt, and clay. It doesn't really fit in there at all. It's strictly, like I said, you're describing the mineral portion of the soil. The more organic material you have, the better your soil structure is going to be. And the difference between the soil texture is just the proportion of sand, silt, and clay. Soil structure is the aggregation of your soil that's going to create that diversity of pore space, so that you get those large, medium, small sized pore spaces. So the large pore spaces will allow the biology and the roots and the water and the nutrients to move through there well, and allow it to function properly.
And another customer is asking, should they add nematodes to their soil?
Okay, there should, when trying nematodes, there are good nematodes and there are bad nematodes. And so you certainly don't want to add the bad guys. Like the one that I showed on that one slide was a bad nematode that eats your tomato roots and other plant roots. But generally you don't need to add beneficial nematodes unless you are having a problem. For example, in the most common reason for putting in and adding beneficial nematodes to your soil, and you would add them to your soil, not your compost, would be is if you've got skunks or raccoons digging up your landscape or your garden. And the reason they're doing that is they're after a food source, which are little insects, little white insects in the shape of a C. They're called grubs, and that's their food source. And they live underneath the surface of the soil, and they're digging for those little critters. And the nice thing about the beneficial nematodes, and most of your nurseries sell them. You can also order them online through that fancy internet thing. What they will do is you water them in, you apply them at night, and you water them in really, really good. Then you water them in the next morning. If they get hit by sunlight, they will die. So you need to water them in really, really well, and they will kill biologically the grubs. It's not a pesticide. It's a living little microscopic worm, and it'll kill the grubs. And then without the grubs there, the worms and the skunks aren't gonna be there. And you really don't have to eliminate them all. You just have to get the numbers down so that the skunks don't and the raccoons don't know they're there. Now, if you're using beneficial nematodes, it's really important before you apply them that you make sure they're alive. If they're not alive, they're not going to kill the pests. And so what you can do is you take a small sample of the product that you purchased, put it on a dark plate, add some water, mix it up, and let it get to room temperature. A lot of times these materials are kept in the refrigerator to preserve them and keep them alive. And after about 5 minutes, you get a magnifying glass, a good magnifying glass, and take a look at the white little dots that you see on the plate. And the vast majority of them should be wiggling around a little bit. If they're not wiggling around, they're dead. And if they're dead, they're not going to be able to kill the grubs.
And then we have another question just about mulching. And so they want to add bark, but they want to know, should they spread a layer of compost before adding bark, or what would you recommend with that?
Yeah, adding compost at any time is a good idea. I think if you've got bark or wood chips, you can put it down before, but it's also a good idea. You can put the compost down, then you can put your bark or wood chips down, but then periodically, numerous times a year, it's a good idea, especially in fall, because the rain will water it in, is to put compost back on top of your mulch. And water it in so it gets to the soil surface where the soil biology can then make it work. Now, I prefer the wood chips over bark because the bark, it's almost all big hunks, and which will last longer than the wood chips. But it's going to, one of the benefits of the wood chips is it has lots of a diversity of sized particles. And so the small little pieces of wood chips will very quickly be munched up by the soil biology and start improving the quality of your soil, versus the bark where it's just the large chips. It's going to take a long time, and it's not as effective the bark is not as effective as improving the soil. It'll conserve water and help prevent weeds, but it doesn't improve the quality of the soil as well as the wood chips.
Right. So we're coming up on an hour now, and I want to be respectful of your time. So I think we're just going to cut off the questions there. And we'll be posting this to our YouTube shortly, so look out for it if you want to review it. And yeah, thank you for all participating. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks. Appreciate it.